Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at Stalin's leadership
Okay.
from 1929 to 1941.
Right.
It's a pretty fascinating period.
It is.
Obviously, the lead up to World War II.
Right.
Just a time of incredible upheaval and political maneuvering.
For sure.
And we're going to be using as our guide for this journey Stephen Kotkin's biography of Stalin,
Right.
and focusing on the volume that covers these years leading right up to the Nazi-Soviet pact.
All right. Well, let's dive in then.
Yeah, so get ready for some shocking twists and turns because this period is full of them.
You got it.
Yeah.
What's so captivating about this period is that it wasn't just about Stalin consolidating his power in the Soviet Union.
Right.
It was also about the rise of another dictator across Europe.
Adolf Hitler.
Yeah. Okay. So picture this.
Okay.
It's the late 1920s,
Right.
early 1930s.
Yeah.
Stalin is already firmly in control of the
Right.
Soviet Union.
That's right. But Hitler is still a relatively minor figure, even landing himself in prison after that failed beer hall putsch in 1923.
Yeah. I mean, two dictators, two very different paths to power.
Yeah. Very
For
different.
sure.
But
There were some intriguing parallels, too.
oh, yeah, absolutely. Both were masters of manipulating public opinion
Right.
and consolidating their authority. Both were driven by a vision of national greatness,
Yeah,
though obviously through very different ideologies.
of course.
And
Yeah,
both would leave a devastating mark on the 20th century.
definitely. It's kind of wild to think that Stalin actually admired some aspects of Germany.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Kotkin highlights how Stalin was
Interesting.
almost obsessed with their industrial and military might.
Uh-huh.
And it kind of stems back to his brief time in Berlin in 1907,
Okay.
which seems to have really stuck with him.
That's a really important detail because it helps explain some of Stalin's later decisions.
Oh, how... You see, his admiration for Germany's industry would later influence his push for rapid industrialization to the Soviet Union.
He wanted to keep up.
Exactly. He wanted to transform the Soviet Union into a modern industrial power,
Right.
capable of competing with the likes of Germany in the West.
Yeah.
And he was willing to do whatever it took to achieve that goal.
And that goal came with a heavy price tag, though, didn't it?
Absolutely. Stalin's ambitions led to some of the darkest chapters in Soviet history.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to reconcile the image of Stalin like the ruthless dictator with
Yeah.
Stalin the family man.
Yeah.
Kotkin gives us these glimpses into Stalin's personal life,
Oh, okay.
mentioning his marriage to Nadia,
Yeah.
their children,
Yeah.
and then tragically her suicide in 1932.
Oh, wow. It's hard to say definitively how Nadia's death impacted Stalin,
Yeah.
but it's certainly a turning point in his life.
Right.
It coincides with a period of escalating paranoia and brutality within the Soviet system.
It makes you wonder what was going on inside his head.
Definitely. I mean, did this personal tragedy fuel his ruthlessness?
It's a good question.
Yeah, it's definitely a question worth pondering.
For sure.
What we do know is that Stalin was deeply committed to building a socialist great power,
Okay.
and he rejected any notion of a rule of law state.
So he's...
For Stalin, force was the only way to achieve his revolutionary vision,
Oh,
and the human cost was secondary.
got it. And those costs were staggering.
Oh, yeah.
To fully grasp the brutality of Stalin's regime,
Yeah.
you have to understand the forced collectivization of agriculture
Right.
and the devastating famine it caused.
Right.
So imagine this.
Right.
It's 1932,
Okay.
1933,
Mm-hmm.
and the Soviet countryside is gripped by a famine so horrific it's often compared to the biblical apocalypse.
Wow.
And we're talking about 50 to 70 million people affected by starvation,
Goodness.
a direct consequence of Stalin's policies.
It's hard to comprehend the scale of suffering.
It is.
Yet Stalin remained unwavering.
He saw any resistance to collectivization as a threat to his authority
Right.
and ruthlessly crushed it.
Yeah, Kotkin mentions figures like Surtsov and Ryutin,
Oh, yeah.
who dared to challenge Stalin's policies. They were swiftly silenced.
The chilling reminder of the danger of opposing the regime.
Definitely. So you have this horrific famine unfolding.
Right.
And at the same time, Stalin is pushing full steam ahead with industrialization.
So the world's in the grips of the Great Depression.
Yeah.
But Stalin is determined to modernize the Soviet Union at any cost.
Right. It's almost like a contradiction.
It is. It definitely highlights the complexities of the time.
Yeah.
Kotkin mentions these massive contracts the Soviets signed with foreign companies like DuPont and Westvaco.
Really?
They were desperate to catch up with the industrialized West, even if it meant compromising their ideological purity.
And looming over all of this is Leon Trotsky.
Ah, yes.
Stalin's arch-rival forced into exile,
Right.
but still a potent symbol of opposition.
That's right. Even from afar, Trotsky posed a threat.
He did.
His writings, his criticisms of Stalin's regime, all of it fueled Stalin's paranoia and served as a justification for the purges and terror that were about to grip the Soviet Union.
Trotsky became the perfect scapegoat.
How so?
He embodied the enemy,
Okay.
both internal and external,
Right.
allowing Stalin to justify his increasingly brutal actions.
And it's not just Trotsky.
Yeah.
Stalin was obsessed with rooting out any potential threat, any whisper of dissent.
Any little thing.
He was building a system where fear was the ultimate instrument of control.
That's right. And then in 1934 comes a turning point.
Oh, what's that?
The assassination of Sergei Kirov,
Okay.
a prominent Bolshevik leader.
Right.
The circumstances surrounding Kirov's death are still debated today.
I bet.
But one thing is clear. Stalin capitalized on this event to consolidate his power.
Oh, wow.
And unleash a wave of terror that would engulf the Soviet Union.
The Kirov assassination provided the perfect pretext for Stalin to eliminate his rivals and tighten his grip on the party.
You got it. He used the assassination to justify a series of show trials.
What were those like?
These grotesque spectacles where forced confessions,
oh, wow,
scripted testimonies became the norm.
Goodness.
It was a masterclass in political theater designed to instill terror and crush any remaining opposition.
Those show trials are just chilling to read about.
They are.
Imagine being forced to confess to crimes you didn't commit.
Yeah?
Your words carefully manipulated to fit Stalin's narrative.
Exactly. It's a glimpse into the dark heart of a totalitarian regime.
Right.
Where truth becomes whatever the dictator says it is.
And at the center of this machinery of terror was Nikolai Yezhov.
Yeah.
The new head of the NKVD.
The secret police.
Right.
He emerges as this truly terrifying figure.
Oh, yeah.
Meticulously orchestrating mass arrests and executions.
So we're talking about a man who was basically a mass murderer.
Yeah.
But also, according to Kotkin, had a penchant for poetry and building model ships.
Right.
It's such a bizarre juxtaposition.
It is.
This ruthless enforcer responsible for unimaginable suffering.
Yeah.
Yet also capable of these seemingly mundane hobbies.
Yeah. It's a chilling reminder of the complexities of human nature.
Yeah, it really is.
How even in the face of unspeakable horror, people can compartmentalize and maintain a sense of normalcy.
So we've covered a lot of ground already.
We have.
And it's clear that Stalin's rule wasn't just about brute force.
Right.
He also wanted to control the cultural landscape, too.
Absolutely.
Kotkin talks about the rise of socialist realism in the arts, where Stalin himself would intervene, shaping the narrative and silencing dissenting voices.
Stalin understood that to truly control a society, you have to control not just its actions, but also its thoughts and beliefs.
Wow.
And art, literature, music.
Yeah.
These were all powerful tools for shaping the minds of the masses.
And it wasn't just about promoting a particular ideology. Right.
It was about stifling any form of creativity that didn't align with his vision.
Exactly. I mean, think about the pressure artists and writers must have felt under Stalin's watchful eye.
I can't even imagine.
It's fascinating to see how Stalin navigated this complex world of art and culture.
It is.
He wasn't simply a Philistine crushing any creativity he encountered.
Right.
He had his own ideas about art and its purpose.
Oh, yeah.
And he intervened in sometimes surprising ways.
Like what?
There's this incredible anecdote about Stalin's personal intervention in the fate of Mikhail Bulgakov, the author of The Master and Margarita.
I've heard of that.
Bulgakov was struggling under the restrictions of socialist realism.
Right.
And after the suicide of the poet Mayakovsky, he was in a state of despair.
Oh, wow.
And what does Stalin do?
Wow.
He picks up the phone and calls Bulgakov directly. Can you imagine that the dictator of the Soviet Union personally inquiring whether a Russian writer could live outside his homeland?
It's a moment that reveals both Stalin's control over the artistic world and his awareness of the power of creative minds.
It's such a strange mix of control and a bizarre kind of empathy.
It is. He's this tyrant who's orchestrating terror and censorship, but he also seems to recognize the importance of art and the people who create it.
That's so wild. So we've got this picture of Stalin consolidating his power at home, building this socialist great power through brute force and cultural control.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, the world outside is becoming increasingly volatile.
It is.
Fascism is on the rise in Italy and Germany.
Right.
The Spanish Civil War is raging.
Yeah, all of this is creating a sense of existential threat for the Soviet Union.
And Stalin finds himself walking a tightrope.
He does.
He's ideologically committed to supporting communist movements like the Republicans in Spain.
Yeah.
But he's also a pragmatist.
He is.
He knows that getting too involved could spark a wider European conflict.
Right.
Something he's not yet ready to face.
So he's juggling these competing priorities.
Yeah.
Trying to secure the Soviet Union's future.
Yeah.
While also advancing his ideological agenda.
It's a high-stakes game with potentially devastating consequences.
It is. And it's in this context of growing international tension and domestic terror that Stalin makes a decision that will shock the world.
You're talking about the Nazi-Soviet pact?
I am.
That moment when these two seemingly irreconcilable ideologies, communism and fascism, joined forces.
It's hard to fathom how Stalin, the champion of the proletariat, could make a deal with Hitler, the embodiment of fascist tyranny.
It's crazy.
That's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive.
Okay, sounds good.
We'll explore the events leading up to the pact.
Okay.
The secret negotiations.
Got it.
And the motivations of both Stalin and Hitler.
Yeah.
Get ready, because things are about to get even more intense.
Oh, I bet.
Welcome back. Last time we left off with Stalin walking this tightrope between ideology and pragmatism, dealing with a volatile international scene, internal enemies both real and imagined,
for sure,
and this relentless drive to build up the Soviet Union.
It was a lot.
It was all against the backdrop of the rising Nazi threat.
Yeah.
It's a pressure cooker, to say the least.
And it's in this pressure cooker that Stalin makes a decision that still boggles the mind.
Oh, yeah.
He signs a pact with Hitler. I mean, we're talking about two of the 20th century's most notorious dictators.
I know.
With ideologies that seem completely opposed.
They do.
So how did this even happen?
Well, as you might imagine, it wasn't a sudden decision.
Okay.
Kotkin takes us deep into the events leading up to the pact.
Yeah.
And it reads like a high-stakes thriller.
I bet.
You've got failed diplomatic negotiations, growing distrust between the Soviet Union and the Western powers.
Right.
And this looming sense of war that permeates everything.
So let's break it down.
Okay.
Stalin initially wanted an alliance with Britain and France against Hitler, right?
That's right. He saw the Nazi regime as a threat, but he also deeply distrusted the capitalist West.
Yeah, it seems like he was always trying to play everyone against each other.
He was. Exactly. Stalin had this almost pathological suspicion of the West. He believed they were trying to encircle the Soviet Union to contain its influence and ultimately destroy it.
Right.
So while he recognized the danger Hitler posed, he also saw Britain and France as potential enemies.
Oh.
He was playing a dangerous game, trying to outmaneuver everyone and secure the best possible outcome for the Soviet Union.
It's like a multi-level chess match.
It is.
With Stalin constantly calculating his next move, trying to anticipate his opponent's strategies.
Trying to be a few steps ahead.
But it seems like he was playing against some pretty unreliable players.
You could say that, that's right, the Western powers, especially Britain and France, were hesitant to commit to a firm alliance with the Soviet Union.
Why is that?
They were still scarred by the horrors of World War I.
Right, of course.
And desperate to avoid another conflict.
Makes sense.
Their policy of appeasement towards Hitler, exemplified by the Munich Agreement in 1938, only fueled Stalin's paranoia and convinced him that he couldn't rely on them.
Wait, remind me about the Munich Agreement. What was that about?
Oh, yeah. The Munich Agreement was a watershed moment.
Yeah.
It's 1938.
Okay.
And Hitler's demanding the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. Instead of standing up to Hitler, Britain and France caved to his demands, effectively handing over a chunk of Czechoslovakia in the hope of avoiding war.
Really?
They thought they could appease Hitler, satisfy his hunger for territory, and maintain peace.
Talk about a miscalculation.
It was. And I bet Stalin was watching all of this unfold with a mixture of anger and, well, maybe even a bit of I told you so.
Well, for sure.
You're right. For Stalin, Munich was a betrayal.
It had to be.
It confirmed his worst suspicions about the West and their willingness to sacrifice smaller nations to appease a dictator. He saw it as a clear signal that he couldn't rely on them for protection against Nazi aggression.
So if he couldn't trust the West,
Right.
and Hitler was becoming increasingly aggressive,
He was.
what options did Stalin have left?
He was backed into a corner. He knew that war with Germany was almost inevitable.
Okay.
But he needed time to prepare.
Right.
He needed to strengthen the Red Army, modernize its equipment, and fortify the Soviet Union's borders.
I see.
And that's where the idea of a pact with Hitler, as unthinkable as it seemed, started to make a certain kind of strategic sense.
So crazy, but I can kind of see the logic.
Yeah.
If you can't beat them, join them at least temporarily, right?
Exactly.
Buy yourself some time, get what you can out of the deal, and then prepare for the inevitable showdown.
That's precisely what Stalin did. He opened secret negotiations with Hitler.
Really?
And in August of 1939, they signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact.
Wow.
A non-aggression treaty that sent shockwaves through the world.
So, on the surface, it's this agreement that these two ideological enemies won't attack each other.
Right.
But we know that there was a lot more going on behind the scenes.
Oh, absolutely. The pact contained secret protocols that essentially divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence.
Wow.
Poland, the Baltic states, Finland,
yeah,
they were all carved up
and
designated as either German or Soviet territory.
That's wild.
It was a cynical and brutal agreement.
Yeah.
A pact born out of necessity and expediency.
And it completely shattered any illusions that Stalin was some kind of champion of international communism or defender of the oppressed.
He wasn't. He was willing to make a deal with the devil himself to secure the Soviet Union's interest.
And let's be clear, the consequences of this pact were devastating.
They were. Within weeks, Hitler invaded Poland, triggering World War II.
It all happened so fast.
It did. And the Soviet Union followed suit, grabbing its share of Polish territory.
Oh, wow.
As agreed upon in those secret protocols.
So this pact that was supposed to be about peace turns out to be a blueprint for war and conquest.
It does.
And the Polish people are caught in the middle, victims of this cynical power play between two dictators.
Exactly. It's a brutal chapter in history.
Yeah, it is.
Kotkin doesn't shy away from the horrors of the invasion.
Yeah.
The displacement of millions, the mass arrests, the executions, the deportations.
It's just awful.
It's a chilling reminder of the human cost of these ideological struggles.
Right. It's like this pact unleashes a new era of barbarity.
It does.
With both the Nazis and the Soviets competing for control of Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Each with their own twisted vision of how the world should be.
And Stalin's appetite for territory doesn't stop with Poland.
Really?
He sets his sights on the Baltic states.
Oh, wow.
Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
Okay.
He pressures them into signing treaties that allow the Soviet Union to establish military bases on their soil.
So it begins.
It's a classic case of salami tactics.
Right.
Taking a little bit at a time, using coercion and intimidation to expand Soviet influence.
And then comes Finland.
Oh, yeah.
Stalin demands territorial concessions from the Finns, wanting to push the Soviet border further away from Leningrad, which he sees as vulnerable.
That's right. But the Finns, this small nation with a fierce sense of independence, refused to bow to Stalin's demands.
And that refusal triggers a full-scale Soviet invasion in November of 1939.
It does. The Winter War, as it becomes known, turns out to be a huge miscalculation for Stalin.
Oh, sad.
He expects a quick and decisive victory. But the Finns, despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, put up a fierce resistance.
Wow. It's like David versus Goliath.
It is. This small, scrappy nation holding off the might of the Red Army.
Yeah, I bet Stalin was furious.
He was. The Winter War exposed weaknesses in the Soviet military, the incompetence of some of its commanders and the limitations of its equipment. It was a humiliating experience for Stalin.
Yeah.
And it damaged the Soviet Union's reputation on the world stage.
But even though it was a struggle, Stalin eventually forces the Finns to cede territory.
He does. It's a victory, but it's a costly one, both in terms of casualties and in terms of international prestige.
And while all of this is happening, the invasion of Poland, the Winter War, the expansion of Soviet influence, the terror within the Soviet Union continues unabated.
It does. The purges extend even to the highest levels of the military.
Oh, no.
In 1937, Marshal Tukhachevsky, one of the Red Army's most brilliant commanders, and 7 other top military leaders, are accused of treason in a sham trial and executed.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it?
It is.
Here's Stalin facing the growing threat of Nazi Germany. And he's eliminating some of his most experienced military leaders because of paranoia and suspicion.
It shows the depth of Stalin's distrust, even of those closest to him.
Wow.
He saw enemies everywhere, real and imagined.
And
he was willing to sacrifice anyone, even those who could potentially help defend the Soviet Union, to maintain his grip on power. Welcome back to our deep dive into Stalin's leadership. Yeah, when we left off, Stalin was in a precarious position. He'd expanded the Soviet Union's territory, but at a terrible cost.
In human lives.
Yes, in human lives and also in terms of their international standing.
Right. And of course he'd made a deal with Hitler.
He had.
But we all know how that turned out.
We do. The pact was never going to last.
It's September 1st, 1939.
Yep.
Hitler invades Poland.
It's the start of World War II.
And everything changes.
It does. You can almost feel the world shift on its axis.
So what does Stalin do?
Well, he waits. Just 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
On September 17th, the Soviet Union also invades Poland.
And what's the justification for that?
Officially, it's to protect the Belarusian and Ukrainian populations living there.
Right.
But come on. It's a land grab.
Stalin's taking what he was promised in the secret protocols.
Exactly.
So much for a non-aggression pact.
It was a pact built on a foundation of sand.
And the Polish people are caught in the middle.
They are victims of this cynical power play between two dictators.
A brutal chapter in history, for sure.
It is. And Kotkin doesn't shy away from the horrors of the invasion.
The displacement, the violence.
All of it. The mass arrests, the executions, the deportations. It's a chilling reminder of the human cost of these ideological struggles.
It feels like a whole new era of barbarity is unleashed.
It does.
Yeah.
Both the Nazis and the Soviets vying for control of Eastern Europe.
Each with their own twisted vision of how the world should be.
And it doesn't stop with Poland.
Oh, no. Where does Stalin go next?
He sets his sights on the Baltic states.
Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
It's a whole lot. He pressures them into signing treaties that allow the Soviet Union to establish military bases on their soil.
Those poor countries.
It's classic salami tactics.
Taking a little bit at a time.
Exactly. Using coercion and intimidation to expand Soviet influence.
And then there's Finland.
Ah, yes. Finland. Stalin demands territorial concessions from them.
What does he want?
He wants to push the Soviet border further away from Leningrad.
He sees it as vulnerable.
Right.
But the Finns, they refuse.
They said no to Stalin.
They did. They were a small nation.
But with a fierce sense of independence.
Absolutely. And that refusal triggers a full-scale Soviet invasion in November of 1939.
The Winter War.
That's right.
What a miscalculation that turned out to be for Stalin.
The huge one. He expected a quick and decisive victory. But the Finns put up incredible resistance.
Despite being outnumbered.
Vastly. They were outgunned too, but they held their ground.
I bet that was humiliating for Stalin.
It was. The Winter War exposed weaknesses in the Soviet military.
Really?
The incompetence of some of its commanders, the limitations of their equipment. It damaged their reputation on the world stage.
But Stalin still won in the end, right?
In a sense, he forced the Finns to cede territory. But it was a Pyrrhic victory.
Costly.
Very. In terms of casualties and international prestige.
So, on the one hand, you've got this expansion of Soviet power.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's this growing sense of vulnerability. There is. And let's not forget what's happening inside the Soviet Union during all of this.
The purges are still going on.
They are. In fact, they're intensifying.
Even with a war on the horizon.
Even then. The purges extend to the military.
The military.
High-ranking officers are targeted.
Like who?
In 1937, Marshal Tukhachevsky, one of their most brilliant commanders.
Wow.
He and 7 other top military leaders are accused of treason.
In a show trial.
Of course, a complete sham. And they're executed.
He's eliminating his own best people.
That's the thing about Stalin. He was consumed by paranoia.
He saw enemies everywhere.
Everywhere. Even among his closest allies.
It's a chilling thought.
It is. It shows how far he was willing to go to maintain his grip on power.
So here we are at the end of our deep dive.
You've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
From collectivization and famine to the purges and the pact with Hitler.
And now the Soviet Union is at war.
A war that Stalin knows he can't avoid forever.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But it's essential to understand this period if we want to make sense of the 20th century.
Absolutely. Stalin's legacy is complex and contested.
It is. He was a tyrant responsible for unimaginable suffering.
Right.
But he also led the Soviet Union to victory in World War II.
It's hard to reconcile those two things.
It is. But history is full of contradictions.
Well, thank you for guiding us through this fascinating and disturbing period.
It's been my pleasure.
And thank you all for listening to our deep dive into Stalin's leadership. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.